One of two on natural systems, the final theory that we are going to be covering in the course, and one of my particular favorites. In my experience, most students are drawn very much to natural systems theory and find that its application to clinical practice is very clear and direct and prompts a lot of new ideas about our role as therapists and the possibilities for change that our clients can experience. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in to the material for this week. So the concept of a natural system assumes that systems exist in nature independently of man's creating them. Now, as you've probably already noticed, this is a bit of a divergence from the epistemological position of constructivists and social constructivists, as you read and heard about last week when learning language systems. We're now grounded in the assumption that systems, in fact, do exist in nature without us having to create them, without us having to language them, without us having to agree upon their existence. The position of natural systems theory also posits that natural systems do not depend on humans being aware of them. And the principles that govern a natural system are written in nature, not created by the human brain. So again, quite a departure from last week's presumptions and presuppositions within the context of language systems and those epistemological ideas coming from the constructivist and social constructionist perspectives. So to sum up again here, natural systems view is essentially that natural systems are out there in nature. They exist. We don't have to decide that they exist. Some examples of these kinds of natural systems include the solar system, ant colonies, the tides, the cell, and the human body, right? As an extension of that, the human family system exists as well in nature. It was not birthed from the human brain. In the natural systems view, the human is a part of life. And all human qualities can be explained by the same theories that apply to the rest of the world. Okay, so the main idea here is that although we like to think of ourselves as being particularly special, we human beings that is, essentially we possess the same qualities that can be explained by the same theories that apply to other systems in the world, including, like I said earlier, something as small as an ant colony or as a microorganism or bacteria. The principles that can be applied to explain the organization of those kinds of systems are the same principles that can be used to describe and explain how human systems function. So where do these ideas come from? Well, there are a couple of really important contributors to natural systems theory. The most well recognized, of course, being Charles Darwin. He was an important natural systems thinker in the 1800s, the late 1800s. His research came from the field of observations. He based his theoretical facts on comparative anatomy and physiology. You are probably familiar with Darwin's ideas and his research in the Galapagos Islands on evolution, biology, anatomy, and physiology. His most recognized books on the origin of species by means of natural selection and the descent of man offered a lot of the ideas that we now use to understand natural systems and evolution, particularly human evolution. Darwin's basic theory was that all life originated from a common ancestor, and that the present diversity that we can find among plants and animals in our ecosystem was a product of continuing variation in each generation of life that combined with different reproductive and survival factors of individuals within each generation. Darwin's theory viewed nature as a system organized according to reciprocal relationships that are mutually interdependent and influenced. So Darwin's idea of what a system is and how a system operates is very similar to how we've been talking about systems since the beginning of this term. But where Darwin grounded his view was in nature, right? Looking at the world around him, looking at the evolution of, again, plants and animals generation after generation after generation, he came to the conclusion that nature is essentially one large system containing multiple, innumerable subsystems, right, that interrelate, that interdepend, and that mutually influence one another in this big interlocking pattern that includes all of nature. The other important contributor to natural systems theory, who we don't hear about as much as we hear and talk about Charles Darwin, is Edward O. Wilson. He wrote Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, and the basic assumptions of his theory are based essentially on how biology affects human behavior. So as you can see, and as the word natural in natural systems theories implies, what we're talking about when we're talking about natural systems theory is essentially biological and ecological in nature. We're looking at the ways in which human nature and human systems follow the same rules, laws, and principles as everything else in nature, as every other biological species. Wilson's theory is essentially this. Human life is one of the forms of life in nature. Not the best one, not the most important one, not the most special one of. Other forms of life include animals, insects, plants, etc. There is continuity between humans and the rest of nature, meaning that human species are no different from other species involving in nature. So essentially, if we look at how other species evolve, if we look at how other species operate, we get a lot of important clues about how humans operate because we're no different. Human functioning, therefore, is similar to the functioning of all other forms of life. And social functioning is present in all forms of life. This is not particular to us. This is not unique to us. There are biological bases of human social behaviors, and these include evolution, senses, instincts, genetics, right? These things that we do, these things that drive us, these things that make us up, have biological bases, and we share them in common with other forms of life in nature. Wilson also posed that there are diverse aspects of human nature that are universal in human societies, and these can include expressions like aggression, faith, love, affiliation, attachment, etc. And human social systems have been shaped by evolutionary processes. So he was thinking along the same lines as Darwin in this respect. According to Wilson, the ultimate goal of any organism, human or otherwise, is to survive and reproduce, to progenate and carry on the species. And it is species, not individuals, that evolve and persist through time. So, like we've been doing throughout the trimester, we are expanding our view from the individual view to the systemic view. And in the natural systems context, this means looking not at the individual human, not at the individual species, right, but at species in general and their evolution and their persistence through time and their processes of interrelating, of interacting, of interdependence. So, how does this apply to family therapy? Well, a guy named Murray Bowen developed a theory called Bowen's family systems theory around the 1970s and 1980s. You are going to read some of his work next week, so his ideas will become much clearer. I did also provide a website for you to check out with the major tenets of Bowen family systems theory in the syllabus this week. So make sure that you check that out and read the primary concepts and principles that are listed there. So Bowen used the concepts that already existed about natural systems theory to create his model of family systems theory. Okay? And this is important to remember. Bowen family systems theory should not be confused with systems theory in family therapy, which includes cybernetics and language systems. So when we talk about systems theory in a sort of general sense, we're talking about everything we've covered in this class. We're talking about first order cybernetics, second order cybernetics, language systems theory, etc. But Bowen's family systems theory is a particular approach, and so it's important to remember that when we talk about family systems theory in our field, we're generally talking about Murray Bowen's approach. When we talk more generally about systems theories, we're talking about all these other theories and concepts that we've covered in the class. So an important thing to keep in mind there. So here are the theoretical basic assumptions of Bowen's model. The family is a single emotional unit. So the things that drive the processes within a family system are emotional in nature, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next couple of weeks about what specifically Bowen meant by that. Individual behavior is closely related to the functioning of one's family of origin. Okay, so what that means is if I take any individual on the planet and I observe his or her behavior, consistent with the systemic view that we've been taking already in general, Bowen is saying that person's behavior, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, is closely related and to some degree dependent on the functioning of that person's family of origin. In other words, the functioning of the family that that person was born into. So to understand that person's behavior, we would look to the person's family of origin and the processes of that system. Patterns of behavior, according to Bowen, in an individual's multi-generational family identify multiple factors that interact across time and produce symptoms and dysfunction. Okay, so what they're saying here, what Bowen is saying here, is that symptoms, like we think about them in mental health settings, and dysfunction, as we might talk about it or understand it in terms of mental health, in terms of human cognition, behavior, emotion, and relationship, so these symptoms and dysfunction can be traced back to patterns of behavior in a person's multi-generational family. So we're not just talking now about the individual's interactions with their family of origin. We're talking about patterns that have persisted across generations in a particular family. That those patterns are in part responsible for the symptoms and dysfunction that we see in the individual or within that individual's family system. Okay, so we can trace these things back across generations, over time, to find their roots and to make sense of them. So therefore, within this approach, genograms are important. They're really a cornerstone of the therapeutic model. Genograms you'll read about and we'll talk about some more are essentially a way of mapping family processes. So it's a symbolic shorthand language that Bowen family systems therapists use to track family patterns. If you want to look up some genograms online, you'll see how intricate they can get and how much information they yield about family processes, particularly going back across generations. And basically how that process plays out in therapy is through the therapist conducting a pretty thorough interview with the client about the client's family, about their existing family members and their family of origin, their family of creation, so if they're married and they have their own children, tracking those patterns, and going back as far as the client is able to take the therapist back to look at those patterns over time. And you can find some pretty fascinating and interesting information out just by looking at a family genogram. So let's go a little bit more into depth with the concepts from Bowen family systems theory. The first is the sort of bedrock concept from this theory, which is the emotional system. This concept suggests that there is the existence of a naturally occurring system in all forms of life that enables an organism to receive information both from within itself and from the outside environment, to integrate that information, and to respond on the basis of it. The emotional system includes mechanisms such as those involved in obtaining food, reproducing, fleeing enemies, rearing young, and other aspects of social relationships. So what Bowen is basically referring to here are drives that move an organism toward survival and reproduction, or carrying on of the species. And those sort of drives, those mechanisms that again are both internal processes and interactions with the environment, those are things that are consistent and found universally across naturally occurring systems. So they apply to humans and human systems, but they also apply to all other systems in nature. And that is what he calls the emotional system. So when we see the word emotional, when we're talking about Bowen family systems theories, we're not talking about prime emotions like mood markers, like sadness or happiness or joy or ecstasy. We're talking more at the biological level about these forces and drives, really, that enable organisms to receive information, make use of it, and essentially respond on the basis of it. So that's emotional process, according to Bowen. And the concept of the emotional system, like I mentioned, is one of the most important in family systems theory. So it's really important that we distinguish it from the way we typically talk about emotion. This concept, the concept of the emotional system, assumes several things. One, that we are born into our own emotional system, which is our family. Two, that forces through emotion can be recognized through what Bowen refers to as anxiety. Three, anxiety, in Bowen's terms, is triggered if a person is too close to others or too removed from others. And four, if there is too much anxiety in a system, people start to react to one another. Okay, so just as when we're talking Bowen family systems theories, when we refer to emotion, we're talking about a different kind of emotional process here. When we talk about anxiety in the context of Bowen family systems theory, we're talking about something very particular. Anxiety is this emotional process that gets triggered if a person in a family system is either too close to others or too removed from the others. Okay? That closeness or detachment among members of a family system triggers anxiety within the system. If there is too much anxiety within the system, people start to become reactive to one another. And we're going to expand on that both this week and next week. But before we continue to expand on that and dive into the particular concepts that give more information about anxiety and the functioning of the emotional unit, the emotional system, let's quickly name the 8 interlocking theoretical concepts proposed by Bowen. Because all of those concepts and understanding of all of those concepts is going to give you a much deeper and more comprehensive understanding of the emotional process within the family system, and particularly the process of anxiety, how anxiety functions within human systems. So the basic 8 concepts from Bowen that all interlock with one another are the following: differentiation of self, emotional cutoff, triangles, again, another concept that has a particular meaning within the context of this theory, nuclear family emotional system, family projection process, multi-generational transmission process, sibling position, and societal regression. And like I said, we're going to be covering all of those both this and next week. And so between the lecture and the readings and your exploration of the website that I gave you and any other research that you want to do on Bowen family systems theory, you should get a pretty clear picture, a pretty general overview of what this theory is and how it works in therapy. So let's start with one of the most important concepts from Bowen family systems theory, and that is differentiation of self. And we're going to contrast it here with enmeshment. So what Bowen says is families differ somewhat in their degree of interdependence. In other words, to the degree to which family members depend on one another. But interdependence is always present in families. The basic building blocks of a self, of a human self, of a person's sense of self, are inborn. They're innate. Okay, we come into the world with those basic building blocks. But an individual's relationships with their family members during childhood and adolescence primarily determine how much self that person develops. Once established, the level of self rarely changes unless a person makes a structured, long-term effort to change it. So listen to what Bowen is saying here. What Bowen is saying here is that we are all born with the basic building blocks, biologically speaking, psychologically speaking, cognitively speaking, of a self. A sense of myself as unique, autonomous, and apart from everybody else. These things we're born with. However, our environment, and predominantly and primarily, most importantly as it pertains to this theory, our relationships with our caregivers and our family members in early life determine and shape how much selfhood we have, how much of a sense of self we possess. And once that is established through our early relationships within our families of origin, that level of self, we could also call it emotional autonomy, rarely changes throughout the lifespan unless a person makes a structured, deliberate, intentional, and long-term effort to change it. Individuals vary in their susceptibility to groupthink. Okay, so there's a range among human beings, among individuals, for how much the individual functions independently, thinks independently, makes decisions independently, is driven by their own emotions versus other people's emotions, versus being driven toward groupthink, taking on the persona or identity or emotional process of the people around them. Okay, and groups vary in the amount of pressure that they exert for conformity, and these groups include families. So families all differ in the degree to which they push individual family members to think like the herd, to think like everybody else, and to conform with the norms of the group. These differences between individuals and between groups reflect differences in people's levels of differentiation of self. Okay? The less developed a person's self, the more impact others have on that person's functioning. And the more the person tries to control, either actively or passively, the functioning of others. Okay, let's say that again. The differences between individuals and groups in terms of their susceptibility to conform or be subject to groupthink is a reflection of their levels of differentiation of self. The less developed a person's sense of self, the less differentiated a person is, in other words, the more impact others are going to have on their functioning. And the more that person is going to attempt to control, either deliberately, indirectly, or passively, the functioning of other people. A person who is well differentiated, a person who has a higher level of differentiation of self, recognizes his or her realistic dependence on others, but can stay calm and clear-headed enough in the face of conflict, criticism, and rejection to distinguish thinking rooted in a careful assessment of the facts from thinking clouded by emotionality. So a person who is well differentiated, a person who has a high level of differentiation of self, understands that human beings are interdependent and that to some degree we all depend on other people for our emotional functioning. We are reactive to other people's emotions. We are responsive to other people's emotions. Other people's emotions affect us. Other people's decisions affect us. Other people's actions affect us, right? The differentiated person understands all of that. And knowing that, that kind of person is able to stay calm and clear-headed in the face of all manner of stuff coming in at them from the outside, whether it's conflict or criticism or rejection or other people's anxiety, right? Or chaos and drama in a work environment. They're able to think clearly in those situations and make decisions that are rooted in a careful assessment of what's going on rather than an emotional gut, knee-jerk, instinctive reaction to the emotional stuff. A person who is not well differentiated can't do that. They simply react. If their partner's having a bad day, they're having a bad day. If the workplace is asserting a certain kind of pressure on them, they're going to act in particular kinds of ways. Not because they think it through and say, this is happening, I'm experiencing this, and I'm going to make this kind of decision, but simply instinctively and emotionally reacting to what's going on around them. Okay, so that's one of the differences between a differentiated and a non-differentiated person, according to Bowen. Thoughtfully acquired principles, like those that come from the Bible or from societies, help guide decision-making about important family and social issues, thus making the differentiated person less at the mercy of the feelings of the moment. So what this is basically saying is the person who is well differentiated isn't simply bounced around like a billiard ball at the mercy of whatever's happening in the environment at the moment, the feelings of the people around them, the intensity of what's going on around them. They're able to think clearly and rationally in all situations, regardless of the degree of emotion around them, regardless of the drama going on around them, regardless of the feelings expressed or felt of the people around them. And they're driven more by principles. They have a clear sense of their principles. They internalize them, whether they come from religious traditions or societal traditions or family traditions. They act according to those principles. And they're able to draw upon those when making decisions because they can see past the emotional content of what's going on and think rationally and respond to situations rather than have a knee-jerk reaction to them. I hope that that's clear. Please feel free to ask any questions in the discussion board about this concept because it is an important one in Bowen natural systems theory, and the degree to which you understand it is going to help you understand your clients from a different kind of perspective. Confident in his thinking, a differentiated person can either support another's view without being a disciple, without just taking it hook, line, and sinker and swallowing it without thought, or reject another person's view without polarizing the differences. He or she defines self without being pushy and deals with pressure to yield without being wishy-washy. So they are independent, they are autonomous, but they're not shoving it in your face. They think for themselves, not in a reactionary way, not in a rebellious way, but in a way that is driven more independently from their own principles, from their own sense of self, of what they want, of what they're about, of what they stand for. And again, less subject and less at the mercy of what's going on around them. Differentiation of self can be seen when a person can be close to people or apart from people and not react with anxiety. Bowen believed very strongly in the importance of differentiation of self. It's a major part of the way that this theory translates into therapy. His approach to therapy relied very heavily on a style of what essentially looks like coaching, designed to improve a client's level of differentiation of self. So even though this is a family systems-based approach, it often comes in the form of individual therapy. At least it did with Bowen, and what Bowen was essentially doing was coaching his clients to improve their level of differentiation of self, or in other words, their ability to respond based on clear, rational thought rather than react based on emotion and instinct. So let's use an example to kind of put this into some context here. What this might look like is the coaching of an adult who's getting ready to go home for Thanksgiving and has reported to the therapist that every time he goes home, he regresses to acting like a child. So this is a client who comes in to a Bowen Family Systems therapist and says, I'm super anxious, I'm going to go home for Thanksgiving. I really want it to go differently than it's gone before. Every time I go home for Thanksgiving, no matter how well I'm doing, no matter how successful I am, no matter how old I get, I walk into my mother's house and I am once again a child. I am my mother's child. And this doesn't go well for anyone, and it doesn't feel good for me, and I want to do this differently. Because what ends up happening is I get upset with my parents, I yell, we fight, I get depressed, and I don't want to go back. Right? So the Bowen Family Systems therapist would work with this client to basically, over the course of multiple sessions, learn how to visit his parents and be close to each one of them, as well as his other family members, without letting these family visits get to him, without letting these family visits affect him to such a degree, allowing him to re-enter that emotional family environment without becoming emotionally reactive, without losing his sense of self, without being subject to his mood, his emotions, his thinking, being driven by what's going on around him. He would learn, in other words, how to respond to his family members rather than emotionally react to them. So how to be in the environment, take in what's going on, clearly move through that environment while staying connected to his family members, enjoying their company, being present with them, but being driven by his own internal process rather than being tossed around by what's going on around him. And I think that this is, the Thanksgiving is a pretty good example because I think we've all had that experience, haven't we, of going back to our family homes or going back, for a holiday and being around our family members and having this sense of ourselves as totally different from the sense of ourselves that we carry throughout the rest of our lives. There is something very powerful, and Bowen would say very evolutionarily grounded, or very biologically, naturally driven thing that happens when we are around our emotional family unit, which is to say our family of origin, right? And I think many of us have had that experience of going home and finding ourselves getting upset with our family members or yelling or getting depressed. I mean, it's sort of like that perennial family holiday scene. We see it in movies. You know, it's infused in our culture, this idea that we sort of regress, and we go back into our old patterns when we are with our families. And that can often be unpleasant. And it often happens at a sort of almost subconscious level, which is that level, you know, that Bowen's talking about, which is the, you know, the natural emotional process. Common among other natural systems. And so what Bowen is doing is making that unconscious process conscious, right? He's raising a person's awareness through the process of trying to increase the person's level of differentiation of self. So becoming aware of how the anxiety within the system, the expressed emotion within the system, affects the individual's functioning. And with that increased awareness comes increased flexibility to act differently in that environment, to be able to respond to what's happening, thinking clearly through what's happening and making clear, rational decisions rather than just becoming emotionally reactive to what's going on. Okay, so that's, I think, enough meat for this week. I really want you to spend your time with what I discussed in the lecture this week, and spend your time with the readings for natural systems. You are going to hear more about it throughout your time in the program, but because it is a pretty involved and comprehensive kind of theory, I want you to really take your time and understand it, and understand how it is unique